So hi, welcome to this session on emotional control, a re-record of the webinar we did last week. Unfortunately, I forgot to press the record button on the Zoom meeting. So I had a few people ask for the recording who were unable to make the webinar. So here it is. Here are the slides, and as much as possible, I'll stick to the same script, which is difficult because I kind of make it up as I go along. But hopefully the slides will keep me in some kind of order, and what you'll get is a sense of emotional control, which follows our webinar on self-control that we did a couple of weeks ago. So this is a series of 8 webinars based around the 4 C's of mental toughness, essentially for both well-being and high performance in the workplace. We did do an original webinar about 6-8 weeks ago on the introduction to the 4C model, the first C being that of control. And thus what followed then was the 2 subsets, self-control, which we did a couple of weeks ago, and now emotional control. My name's David Allen. I run a company, Let's Talk Tough, and as the name implies, then we run training programs and coaching, particularly within business, but also in education and sport on mental toughness. And as already described, really mental toughness for high performance at work, and as well as well-being, with the idea, of course, that we can get both. We can have people who are both happy and feeling fulfilled at work, but also performing to a high level. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to chat through emotional control, a vast subject, and we can't begin to do it justice. Probably worth saying that I'm not a clinical psychologist. My background is in business psychology, and more recently in positive psychology as well as sports psychology. So we'll take it from that kind of angle. You know, there is the risk of going quite deep and dealing with sort of mental health issues, and that's not the intention. It's to look at it sort of on a practical day-to-day basis for mental toughness. Having said that, I'm sure there'll be some kind of ideas and concepts that may be useful to all, whatever the need may be, whatever the level may be. So just a quick recap really on the 4C model of mental toughness, which is where we sort of ground most of our work. And as already described, the first C, if indeed there is an order, is the one of control. It's certainly where we started. But we also have the C's of commitment, confidence, and challenge. And as you can see, then each of the 4 C's is subdivided. So within commitment, we have goal setting and achievement orientation. In confidence, we have social confidence and self-confidence. And in challenge, we have risk, willingness to take risks, and learning, our ability to learn from the risks that we take or the challenges that we embark upon. And as we said, we started with self-control, and so this module here is around emotional control. I guess the question that many people have is probably the one I can't really answer. What exactly are emotions? I'm not sure anybody can answer it, and lots of people have theories and ideas on what emotion is and where it comes from. I mean, it's a sort of relatively recent invention, sort of 1800s. Before, I don't know, 1820, I think, you know, the word emotion didn't even exist. It comes from the French. I think the French to kind of stir things up is where it comes from, and so we can start to get this kind of concept of energy in motion, which is a kind of phrase I like when it comes to kind of trying to describe emotions, energy in motion. And I guess there are 3 sort of key elements to emotion, or sort of 3 schools of thought. And again, this is not the time to be going into any depth on those, but if we can perhaps think about emotion in these 3 areas. On the one hand, we have the sort of subjective experience, and I guess this is about us labeling emotions, and we have these kind of key or core emotions, so excitement or fear and happiness, sadness, etc. And most people kind of can relate to those in the world. However, even those can be highly subjective in terms of the kind of degree, for example, that we note anger or feel anger. And using all these kind of words can be a highly subjective activity. So what's one person's kind of use of the word sadness is very different to another's. So this is subjective immediately. And we don't always experience just sadness or just kind of anger. There are so many sort of levels that we kind of experience within ourselves. So, you know, it's a difficult thing to kind of get to grips with. when we talk about the sort of subjective experience. So we have these kind of norms, these kind of key labels, as I say, these kind of main characteristics of or main words that we use to describe emotion. And one of the questions I have for you in a moment or two is kind of how many do you think there are? So give that one some thought. I'll tell you in a minute or two how many some of the people on the webinar thought, as opposed to kind of how many I came up with, or some research has. We then have a physiological response. So this is the kind of the feeling that we get, that sort of gut feeling, the kind of in the pit of the stomach stuff, when we kind of sense stuff. So the physiological bodily response to emotions, the heart palpitations, the sweat. Those things are sort of indicators of emotion, and that whether they drive emotion or whether they are a byproduct of emotion. Again, plenty of debate on that, but many will see that we have a sort of physiological, biological response to emotion. And then I guess it's the one that we are most familiar with, the behavioral response. So that again, we feel angry, we act angry, and we do angry things. If we feel sad, we cry. So a kind of easy one to identify when we're kind of looking at the emotions of others, of course, is the behavioral response, to get a sense of how people feel, and the manifestation within our own body of we get a sense of something, and then behaviorally is how we act that out. So those are the kind of three elements of emotions that are worth kind of thinking around, and again, there's plenty of debate as to the kind of which drives what, and the variations that sit just within those key elements. But if we can think of it as energy in motion, then that gives us a good kind of starting place, I think. And as I said, in terms of kind of how many, well, a lot of the people on the webinar the other day were sort of putting them between sort of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in terms of how many emotions there are. As we can probably guess already, there is almost an infinite number, depending on words you want to use to describe emotion. There is a guy called Dr. Alan Watkins, and actually if you Google him, and particularly I think it's called The Universe of Emotions, it's an app, and there's also a TED talk that he did, so Google in Universe of Emotions. He identifies over 2,000 emotions, and he's mapped them. So he's created an emotional universe. So what you can get are sort of galaxies of emotions, i.e. sort of groups of emotions, so words that kind of sit together. And it's a really quite a nice app to kind of start to understand the myriad of words and descriptors we have for emotions. But also, I guess, what we have is these planets, these that orbit each other, i.e., which kind of universes or sort of system of planets do you live in, or you identify with more than others. And so as a way of beginning to identify kind of where you spend a lot of time emotionally, then the app is quite a nice way of kind of mapping it out and taking a look, or beginning to understand the emotions of others and the relationship that we have with emotions. So I'm not sure how much it costs. I think there's a free app as always, and then I think it costed maybe sort of £3 to have a look at the Universe of Emotions app. But maybe go and have a look at the YouTube TED Talk video from Dr. Alan Watkins, because one of the other things he says is quite interesting is that most of us emotionally are stuck around the age of 9 years old, which is a bit scary, really. We get to about 9 years old, and after that, emotionally, we tend not to mature much beyond that. In many cases, we kind of learn the rules, and then we kind of abide by those rules. And when those rules don't work for us, then emotionally, we find it quite difficult to cope. So there's a few words to say on that. So it's quite a humorous talk as well. Around emotions and our immaturity perhaps in them. But it is certainly food for thought, is that how much time, effort and energy do we spend in really trying to kind of work on our emotions and be able to control or regulate our emotions better, particularly in situations of stress, pressure, etc. And so emotional regulation is key. And when I say emotional regulation, I mean emotional control. Again, there is discussion about, control sits within emotional regulation. There are other aspects to that sit underneath emotional regulation. But for our purposes now, read emotional regulation, emotional control. And I guess there's a way to define it as a process to which individuals influence which emotions they have, and kind of when and how they experience them. So it's the process which we have with our emotions, and what we kind of do with them. And it can be kind of automatic, or it can be controlled, conscious or unconscious. And so again, depending on our level of, let's say, emotional maturity, depends on our level of sort of consciousness and control or regulation we have within the process of kind of expressing those emotions and feeling those emotions within ourselves. And from that, then I guess we have sort of three components or three things that we can do with our emotions in terms of regulation. So we can initiate actions that are triggered by our emotions. So I'm angry, I'm going to act angry, as I kind of said to you earlier on. So I can initiate anger. Emotional regulation allows me to kind of identify anger and then do something with it. It can also allow me to inhibit actions. So it can go, okay, angry, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to lash out, for example. And so really what it's doing is what we sort of say at number 3, which is modulating our responses that are triggered by emotions. And that's kind of where we want to be, is to have that ability where we're not kind of at the whim of our emotions and just initiating or inhibiting with little control. It's absolutely about modulating, is deciding when to initiate and inhibit, and why, and to understand why we are doing so. So modulation is kind of what we're looking to do, which again is relatively obvious and something most of us are pretty good at most of the time. I think the way to think about this is a sort of phrase that I use quite a lot, and may have used even in the self-control, and I'll come back to at the end of this talk, right towards the end. And it comes from the book The Chimp Paradox, by a guy called Dr. Steve Peters. And I think, and I'll won't necessarily quote this verbatim, but the thought is, when was the last time that you said or thought or did something that pretty soon after you wish you hadn't? And for most of us, it was relatively recently. You said something, you did something, you thought something that you just kind of thought pretty quickly afterwards, that wasn't the right thing to do, that wasn't the best thing to do, that wasn't the best of me, that's not really what I should have done. There's lots of ways we can consider that. And if that is something that you do relatively often, that's when we really need to work on our emotional regulation. And in particular, when we do it under, again, stress and pressure. So we can regulate and modulate our responses pretty well most of the time, but it is under pressure and stress where we struggle. And in circumstances such as this, that are unusual, where we find ourselves in waters that we've never sort of navigated before, and that can be really difficult and very confusing, and that can lead to a real difficulty in being able to regulate our emotions. There are obvious kind of benefits to being able to regulate emotions, just that better balance and judgment of kind of feelings and actions, and that allowing us to kind of carefully judge which effective outcomes, i.e. our moods and feelings, etc., to embrace and which one to avoid. So it just means we have choice. We can do the right thing by ourselves and by others. And that's, of course, is really important. And without trying to go too deep right now, let's think of it from the other kind of end of the scale. So where we have emotional regulation, at the other end of the scale, we have emotional dysregulation. And at the extreme ends of the scale, we have emotional regulation disorder. And there's a couple of sort of bullet points you can see probably on the slide in terms of what that looks like. And at the kind of higher levels of ERD, then we have this kind of anger outburst that all of a sudden, just for no reason, we tend to get very angry and upset about stuff, particularly against someone who didn't do anything in particular. We just kind of lashed out a bit. Difficulty in building and maintaining healthy social relationships, both in the personal and professional fields. Attentional dysregulation. So this is the inability to focus on kind of meaningful work. We just kind of possessed with kind of negative thoughts and feelings and emotions, etc. And then hypersensitivity and poor self-control. And if we go right to the deeper ends of the levels, then we're talking about things like self-harm and suicide are outcomes of emotional regulation disorder. So pretty serious stuff. So there are obvious benefits to working hard, and sometimes it is quite hard to regulate our emotions well. And when we start talking about things like emotional regulation disorder, even at the level that a lot of us are talking about here, which is kind of dealing with day-to-day stress, etc., there's something worth looking at. Many people might have heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but maybe not so much on dialectical behavior therapy, DBT. And DBT really is a technique that's kind of looking at opposites. So, you know, when we talk about dia is kind of opposites. Dialectics is about balancing opposite things. So essentially the concept is around acceptance and change kind of techniques is you know, what we need to accept in terms of our emotions, and then what we need to want to change. And it kind of works through a process, as you can see, is number one, we have to have an experience. And for many, that might be quite difficult, is to put ourselves out there to have an experience. And then to be able to recognize the emotions that we feel in that experience, and more about kind of recognizing in a little bit. But we need to identify the emotions that we sense, that we feel. We need to be able to accept those emotions. We are having them, and thus we need to accept them. Doesn't mean we need to like them particularly or necessarily do anything with them, but we do need to accept that they are there. And that then helps us with our kind of regulation, that modulation, that ability to kind of choose what we're going to do with it. And maybe that choice is then to change, to accept that we can regulate, and regulation that means that we have the choice to change. And so dialectical behavior therapy kind of works through a process similar to that, where you're balancing these kind of both acceptance and change, two different things, but working on the same kind of scale, the same sort of foundation. And DBT kind of sits within a sort of four key areas generally, or sorry, emotional regulation sits within four key areas of DBT. So we have mindfulness, and again, we'll come back to that one. It's something we can talk a lot about when we talk about control. Distress and tolerance, reality, acceptance skills are a key part of DBT. As you see there, emotional regulation, and then interpersonal effectiveness. So those sort of four cornerstones often make up what is dialectical behavior therapy. So very much in terms of emotional regulation, you know, therapists work within these four areas to help people become better at say regulating, modulating emotions. So go and have a look at that, you know, particularly if you are really struggling with it. For most of us, though, what we're talking about here is this kind of day-to-day stuff where there are times when we just get emotional. Whether that's fear or anxiety or stress or pressure or excitement or love, etc., is all of a sudden we get emotions that are kind of taking over a little bit, often known as the amygdala hijack. So the kind of part of our brain, the sort of rational thinking part of our brain, essentially gets kind of shut down, disabled, and what we have is this kind of emotional brain that really kicks in and does things that we are unable to control a lot of the time. And again, I've already referenced the chimp paradox. We'll come back to that at the end. There's a really nice way to kind of describe what happens between the sort of limbic system in the brain, the emotional part of the brain, and the sort of neocortex, the higher cortex part of the brain. But for now, this kind of amygdala hijack, this inability to control the emotion because, you know, something just shuts down in our thinking brain. So one of the things that we, in terms of a technique that is worth kind of thinking about, is this concept of kind of cognitive diffusion. So many of us are often cognitively fused, and under pressure and stress, again, we're kind of cognitively fused, i.e., and I'll keep using the same kind of reference, I am angry, I feel the emotion of anger, and now I'm going to be angry, I'm going to behave angry. That's cognitive fusion. Whereas cognitive diffusion is being able to create a gap between kind of what you're feeling and what you do, what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you do. And as you can see from the graphic there is that kind of feeling or sense that you're stupid, and that emotion is, you know, I am stupid. and that judgment of self. Different to I'm having the thought I'm stupid, to recognize that it is just a thought. It doesn't mean it's what you are, it's what you are thinking. And then that cognitive diffusion part is a third angle, is being able to step away from that a bit. And again, we'll come back to that shortly, is to distance yourself, to kind of say, I'm noticing I'm having the thought, I'm stupid. And just by kind of working through that process, is that cognitive diffusion, is to be able to step away, separate kind of what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and what you do with that thinking. There is a good book called Mentelligence that is describes, I think, well, a guy called Chris Lee wrote this relatively recently, and I think it talks about, as I read it here, new psychology of thinking, learn what it takes to be more agile, mindful, and connected in today's world. But it kind of describes cognitive diffusion very well, and more than that, then the book is really good, I think, an up-to-date thinking in terms of emotional regulation and modulation, and how we can kind of maximize it or manage it, particularly again under difficult circumstances. So have a look at cognitive diffusion, and maybe Mentelligence is one way to go with it. I think quite a nice way of describing it for many, for those that are more visual, is putting your hands over your face. So if you kind of put your hands right in front of your face, very difficult to see anything but your hands. But if we start to move those hands away and broaden them out, then all of a sudden we can see our hands, but we can also see a whole lot more. And again, that's what we're talking about with cognitive diffusion, is to kind of broaden things out a bit, to be able to see the bigger picture and get better perspective on stuff. And often, again, under pressure and stress, those hands are right jammed up against our face, and we can see nothing but the skin of the hands, the lines of the hands, the detail there, but no more. So broaden it out a little bit, and perhaps that gives us a bit of space to make better decisions. So from that, what I want to be able to do is just give you 6 tips, techniques, thoughts on emotional regulation before just finishing off with the chimp paradox and some thoughts around that from Steve Peters. So some of these we've kind of talked around a little bit. Many of these that you will know. But as always, the advice is know them or not. It's what you do that's important. So, I always talk about doing these 2 things. Number 1 is do something. Always do something. Action is so important. As I say, we often understand the concepts of this kind of stuff, but it's whether we apply it. So applying it is really important. Applying it consistently is important on a daily basis. But to be able to do that, then we need to do that in small steps. So this is about small shifts in thinking, small changes in terms of the actions that we take. And that's where I'm coming from on any one of these 6 things here. This is not about putting all 6 in place, tomorrow and in a big way. This is about sort of choosing a few nuggets here and there, and bit by bit, building on each one of these practically, actively on a day-to-day basis. And that's where we really get good emotional regulation. So the 6 of these, then we'll kind of break them down one by one briefly. So self-awareness, mindful awareness, cognitive reappraisal, adaptability, self-compassion, and emotional support. So those 6 skills will put us in good stead in terms of better being able to emotionally regulate. In terms of self-awareness, many people know these days a reasonable amount about emotional intelligence. So there are several models in emotional intelligence, but this sort of 4-dimension model of self-awareness for self-management and social awareness and relationship management is one that most people will recognize. So really, generally, right at the very start, right at the very bottom, is this self-awareness. Very difficult to be able to manage self without an awareness of self. Difficult to be aware socially if you're not aware of self. So when we're talking about self-awareness and emotional regulation, really, again, and we've kind of already looked at this entire dialectics to a small degree. There are kind of 2 things, notice and name, I think is what's important. So it's our ability to notice your emotions, to notice when you are anxious, when you are angry, when you are sad, when you're excited, is to be able to kind of go, okay, I notice that I'm feeling emotional, or I'm feeling emotions. And obviously, the more you can begin to notice, then if we notice them at a kind of early level, then we can much better prevent when we get to a kind of more serious emotional state that is now getting a little bit out of control. So it may be in the first instance we're only noticing high emotion, but progressively we become more aware of ourselves and our sort of core, most consistent emotions. If we can identify those earlier on, it becomes much easier to be able to kind of then take a choice as to what we do with it, or to be able to control it before it gets too strong. And the next bit to do around that one is to name it. So I recognize I'm having an emotion. What is it, you ask yourself? Am I feeling anger? Or am I feeling frustration? Is that a different thing? And so this is where the kind of 2,000 different emotions begin to kick in, and understanding a sort of broader breadth of words that we use to describe emotions, because there are subtle differences. As I've already said, again, with anger, there are so many different levels of anger. And so, you know, mild irritation to you know, extreme anger is a big difference. And if we can begin to notice and then name that, and to go, oh, actually, I'm just mildly irritated, that's a very different proposition to something about being apoplectic. So noting and naming is a really effective technique. And so self-awareness helps us notice and name, but notice and naming particularly sort of helps our self-awareness and makes us more self-aware. So again, try and do that on a kind of, in a relaxed way, on a kind of ongoing basis. So this is trying to find maybe a few emotions, maybe when you're not feeling that emotional, you know, when you're sitting having your dinner or something, or when someone says something to you, or you see something, and just kind of trying to find and go, okay, am I feeling any kind of emotion here, and what is that emotion? Once you better do that at that low level, it becomes much easier again to manage at a higher level. So following on from that, then, number two is mindfulness. And once again, mindfulness, like emotional intelligence, has you know, really become quite popular over the past 5 years or so, and rightly so. And mindfulness, that ability to be present, to be fully engaged in the moment. There's a lot of people sort of talk around flow state, and that ability to be absolutely engaged in what you're doing, to the point where you're doing it really well, but you're lost in thought. You haven't got to think about it. And particularly in sport, that's the Xanadu, if you like. It's where most sports people want to be, is that flow zone where you get high performance with little effort. But mindfulness really for us is just about, again, creating that bit of time and space to get into the moment, to stop fretting about the past and worrying about the future, but to stay focused in what's happening in the here and now. And at the same time, then, we can begin to name and notice, as long as we're in the present rather than kind of in the future, or in the past. And so, on the one hand, it's about being in the moment, but the other one, you know, that's key in mindfulness, is about being non-judgmental. Is that ability just to notice the emotion, is take a step away from it. So we talked about cognitive diffusion. Often what mindfulness talks about is a technique called noting. So for example, when you're in a mindful state, a meditative state, it's almost certain that there'll be various thoughts that run through your head. You have no control of those thoughts. These things will just pop into your head, and you'll either follow them through or they'll just pass. But the concept of noting is just to go, okay, I've noticed that thought. I've noticed I'm having a thought. You could go on further to say it's a thought I like or I don't like, or I'd like to move towards or away from. But essentially just kind of noticing it is what's important. And then it's about non-judging and just letting it go. That was a thought. Now let it go. I've recognized it. It's time it can go away right now. And that ability to note and then let go without judging and getting caught up is key in mindfulness. So mindfulness meditation, there are lots of apps, and that's the reason you've got this Headspace slide up at the moment. It's the app that I use. It's one I would highly recommend, but there are many others out there. This one is quite good for you know, particularly those interested in sport as well. There are others, things like Calm, etc. are again good apps to get sort of led or structured mindfulness. So whether you get a book, whether you get an app, or whether you just go and find a quiet space and practice a bit of meditation, mindfulness meditation, either which way, in terms of emotional regulation, it's a really important thing to do. when I talk to people at work all the time, it's about finding time at work to just think. And sometimes thinking is actually almost the opposite. It's just taking time out to not think, is just to calm the thoughts. It is often we just don't have any space at work to think. And if you're not thinking or not kind of creating space to think clearly, then there are obvious consequences to making bad decisions at work. And that's the same in the domestic environment too. So mindfulness, important. Number 3 is about cognitive reappraisal. Fairly straightforward in terms of cognitive reappraisal. Reappraising our thoughts. Thought replacement, I guess, is what we're talking about here. Essentially, it's that ability to come from another perspective, to take it from a different angle. And there are sort of several techniques here, just kind of 3 that are very closely related, but 3 ways of thinking about cognitive reappraisal. So one is being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, or literally go through some kind of role reversal. So this is often used in sort of therapy type sessions or workshops, coaching, etc., where you kind of put yourselves and you swap roles, and what would you think? How would you approach this? How is it coming from your angle? So whether you do that literally, or whether you just imagine you putting yourself in someone else's shoes, then that role reversal is what would they be thinking? How are they going to perceive what I'm behaving, or how I'm behaving towards them? So again, we use the anger one, is if I'm being angry at someone, to be able to put myself in their shoes and be able to see my anger, might then just change the thought process a little bit. As well as role reversal, then we can look at this third party. So if you're observing several other people, having a discussion, having an argument, some kind of emotional contact, then that ability to have that third party viewpoint, maybe a slightly more objective viewpoint, is a really important thing to do. And so often, again, we can do that on a very practical basis, but even just observing others and kind of looking at it from both perspectives and understanding how there are sort of very different emotional responses to this kind of same situation is an interesting sort of education, if nothing else, to ourselves. And then thirdly, we have this kind of objective appraisal. So this is that, again, that cognitive diffusion. It's that ability to kind of step away from our own thought process. Again, mindfulness comes to mind. So you can see all these are very linked. To be able to step away and kind of think objectively about what's going on inside your own head, or in terms of your behavior, or in terms of the behavior of others. Whichever way you look at it, it's about choice, isn't it? It's about taking a different perspective on something, and whether we do that physically and literally kind of take a step back or take a step to one side, whether we look at something different, literally as we turn our eyes or turn our face another way. Another perspective is crucial, and that can be that just that act of doing something physical can sometimes just shift the mindset, just that little bit, to create that little bit of space to then reappraise and slow the emotions down. And again, we'll talk about that in the chimp paradox bit in a little bit. So that ability to cognitive reappraise, take a different perspective, important. At number 4, we have adaptability. As you can see there, a quote from Charles Darwin: "It's not always the strongest that survives, it's often the most adaptable." Adaptability, change, ambiguity. If we think about emotional dysregulation, that kind of reduces our ability to deal with this change and ambiguity. And many people really struggle with the sort of constant change that's going on in life. And so by working on our adaptability, then we are much better able to cope emotionally with the changes that life throws at us, and no better time again than now for that to be an example. So working on our adaptability is really important. And so just some thoughts on how to do so. When we did the live webinar, I did ask for some ideas and thoughts on practical sort of applications, i.e., what is it you actually do to demonstrate adaptability? And I think that's worth a thought, is to take a look at what you do on a day-to-day basis. That keeps you on top. It keeps you flexible, I guess. So just a couple of thoughts that I've got. I think sort of 5 I've got here. And they're fairly straightforward. I don't think there's any rocket science here, but experiencing variety. How much variety do you have on a day-to-day basis? And whether that's variety in terms of what you eat, whether it's variety on maybe a running route that you do, maybe if you are going into work, the routes you might take into work. It's just, on a day-to-day basis, do you do things differently? Or is it always the same stuff? Are you kind of one of these people that's really stuck in sort of habits and routines? So trying to break those a little bit, just in little tiny ways, just experience a little bit of variety, really helps our ability to obviously adapt. And when the big changes come, we're in a better place for it. Looking for balance. So always trying to balance things. And I guess the way I always think about this one is often we kind of tend to look at the downsides of stuff. We tend to look at the negatives. What we don't do so well. So I think it's really important that we balance that up, is to be looking at the positives, looking at kind of what we did well, what was good. But whichever way it is, just looking for both sides, two sides of a coin is really important. So we make a judgment, then look for the other side of things. Look at what could be on the other side. At number 3, tuning in, listening more. Perception, intuition, is sometimes just taking that step back to both hear and see better what's going on around us, allow us to take in sort of more information from perhaps a broader perspective. We can be very narrow-minded, very tunneled in the way we see things and what we do. So I think this ability to kind of zero in a little bit, get a little bit more sort of focus, and it doesn't have to be a narrow focus, that can be a kind of broad focus, but just kind of tune in and get a bit more sort of single-minded in something, rather than just having sort of thoughts and ideas and things going tumbling around your head without any kind of structure. So that ability to kind of tune into what someone's saying, tune into what you're seeing, tune into something in particular is really important, because that allows us then to experience things from a slightly different perspective. Number 4, being willing to experiment and learn. So, similar to the experiencing variety. Do you learn? And of course, the answer is yes. But how often do you seek out learning opportunities? Some of us are comfortable where we're at, and the thought of learning, being challenged, doing stuff that we don't know is uncomfortable for us. Taking risks, and sometimes we just see it as unnecessary risk. Why take the risk is a thought process. But again, whether it's just you're experimenting by baking a cake, whether it's experimenting with something at work, what can you learn? And being just conscious of the learning process. I used to do a lot of work around talent at work, what makes high performers at work. Still a lot of work around that area. But one of the things that consistently came up was this ability to apply learning consistently. High performers recognize that there's lots to learn, and they're looking for learning opportunities, and they're then experimenting with those learning opportunities and developing from those. So that willingness to do something allows us to kind of adapt and become really innovative and drive the kind of learning process. And that, of course, is great for adaptability and change. And then finally, just in general, considering the bigger picture, understanding the bigger picture, looking at the bigger picture, just considering, what may be from a much sort of broader, sort of more 360 perspective, is kind of stop looking just in front of you and kind of just rotate around a little bit, and again, see the different views that are available to you. So it's partly like balance, but it's just taking this kind of broad, wide perspective and considering the picture from other people's perspectives, perhaps. So again, we go back to this kind of idea of looking at it from sort of third parties or other people's perspectives to kind of change our own. So whatever it is you do, adaptability is a key skill, and some see it as the kind of development on from emotional intelligence. Sometimes it's called AQ. So as our ability to adapt to change is what marks out many leaders in organizations, is they're able to see things quicker and drive changes rather than having to respond and react to changes. They adapt quickly. So adaptability. At number 5, self-compassion. We talked the other week, or I did a talk the other week around compassionate leadership. And this idea that compassionate leadership is just so important, particularly again in the times we're living in right now. But over the past few years, then it's become more and more important as people, to be honest, struggle more at work, struggle to be engaged, struggle to just cope with the volume of things that are going on around them. And leadership needs to kind of recognize that and help with, the people side of things. Is this kind of idea that if people are well within themselves, if people are kind of happy in what they do and motivated in what they do, we're going to get better performance. But compassion is recognizing when people are struggling. People are in pain in many ways. And so this kind of idea of compassion is recognizing the struggle in others, but also kind of wanting to do something about it. That kind of motivation to want to help is key when we talk about compassionate leadership. But one of the most important things in compassionate leadership is self-compassion. It's difficult to show compassionate leadership when you're not compassionate to yourself. So the act of kind of noticing and accepting our own flaws and inadequacies is critical, and often we notice them, but it's whether we accept them or not, I think is what's really important. So just three thoughts on this really in terms of self-compassion. So one is this kind of concept of self-kindness. So that's just an appreciation for our own good qualities, is recognizing what we're good at, recognizing, what we like about ourselves. As we recognize it in other people, why not recognize it in yourself and do that actively, do that consciously. Common humanity, I guess, is recognizing those good qualities without kind of feeling isolated or that you're better than others, to kind of not want to do so because that somehow separates you from other people, or that you feel maybe that you might be better than others by saying something. So it's just acknowledging our good qualities without that fear or worry of kind of how we're perceived by others, and not, as I say, not feeling kind of isolated by it. And then finally, mindfulness is paying attention. Paying attention to those good qualities and not taking them for granted, I think is what's really important here. Again, it's that conscious element of taking time to note and to notice strengths and passions and good qualities. And when you're getting feedback, is to kind of accept that feedback and better consider that feedback. So this consciousness is really important all the way through with self-compassion, and it's something that many of us aren't that comfortable with, and perhaps all need to work on a little bit. So let's deal with number 6 at the moment, emotional support. And this is a relatively straightforward one, and one that I think we probably understand quite well. So I took this from sort of two very kind of quite simplistic angles. On the one hand, again, it's about the time and space that we create for ourselves and for others, in terms of getting or offering emotional support. So do you give time to others? What does that look like in terms of being able to provide emotional support from others? Do others find time for you? How can you help others give you time if you're the one that's needing that kind of support, and that kind of space, that scope, in terms of kind of offering time? It's also that kind of space to be kind of not in people's faces, is to allow people to kind of to think and to consider and to talk and to come from their angle. Often we're kind of often too keen sometimes to give emotional support, and thus we don't give people the kind of space they need to kind of really think things through. So it's about going to that one towards the end, is about helping kind of work through choices rather than kind of giving people options all the time. That safe environment, of course, is critical, and that's a physical safe environment, but also a mental safe environment, somewhere that they feel safe, and then somewhere where you feel safe. So if you are looking for emotional support, who can give you that time, who's able to give you the space, and in what environment is that able to happen? Listening, we talked about before. Empathy, really important, and listening, a key skill of empathy. that ability to and willingness to step into someone else's shoes. You know, very difficult to give any kind of emotional support without understanding where someone's coming from. But that's a big ask, and that's a big ask in terms of just having the skill to be able to truly understand where someone's coming from. But it's also a big ask in terms of kind of a willingness and preparedness to say, you know, I'm happy. I'm not going to judge. I'm going to kind of, you know, hear what you have to say. I'm not going to judge, and I'm going to then help you work through what is best for you. And for many, that's quite a difficult step to take. So on the one hand, it's about what we need or what we need to be offering in terms of emotional support. And then the other hand is kind of, well, who from? And so this is identifying your sources of emotional support. And the obvious place for that is with your family. A lot of the time, particularly in these times, is often it's the only place we're able to go to. As we've been in lockdown, then family are often the only people where we could sit down and help kind of work through the difficult emotional times. We have our friends, and progressively now we're able to go and see those friends, although I'm sure over the phone and via Zoom and the like, we've been able to kind of talk to more distant family and friends. It's never quite the same in terms of emotional support. Really, you know, there is no substitute for face-to-face. And so, you know, it's great that now we are more able to see more friends more often than we were before. Colleagues is an interesting one, because colleagues is one that often are a kind of a non-conscious emotional support. You know, we have them at work, we spend so much time at work with them, whether it's over a cup of coffee or lunch or a beer or whatever it is, at the end of the day, is we can kind of whinge and moan and groan about life in general and our bosses and what's happening at home and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And actually that's gone for many people. And it hasn't been replaced. It's not the kind of thing where it's just transferred into Zoom. I hope it has to certain degrees. I hope you still have these conversations with people sort of digitally, but much more difficult and you know, needs to be much more organized than just kind of sitting next to someone or going for a cup of coffee with someone and being able to kind of whinge about life in general. So that's quite a, you know, a big gap that was created a couple of months ago when people all of a sudden in the main had to work from home and more remotely. Beyond our colleagues, then we have broader connections, and that can be a myriad of people, perhaps that we have connected to and with, again, both digitally, but also, of course, on a sort of face-to-face basis. And so, you know, things like, you know, sports clubs and the like come to mind, or, you know, if you have clubs, you know, of hobbies, etc., etc. So, you know, these connections, these people that you know, that you might not put under family, friends and colleagues, but certainly people you know and you chat to, and just even on a kind of subconscious level, again, are able to kind of release some of the sort of pent-up emotions that otherwise, you know, or release emotions that otherwise may be pent up, and when done so for a period of time, may kind of erupt in a way that we wouldn't want them to. Beyond that, well, then we have these kind of two is number one, therapists. So, you know, again, this is not a clinical psychological webinar on the sort of mental health issues around emotional regulation. But there are many therapists working with many different techniques. So we've already talked about dialectic therapy, and the same with CBT, etc. There are lots of kind of good techniques and tools out there and great therapists out there that can help on a kind of slightly deeper level when it comes to emotional control. So well worth looking at those if you are really struggling with this side of things. And then, of course, organizations. What I mean by organizations is you know, all kinds of sort of charities that are out there, organizations that are set up to help people struggling with emotional regulation. So kind of finding that emotional support is obviously critical. Is you know, being alone is tough emotionally, and particularly at these times. Then you know, people have felt, you know, quite isolated to the degree, and so becoming active and finding that emotional support and being willing and able to ask for that support. And then to be able to offer it as well, of course, is such an important thing to be able to do. So emotional support. So those of you that are, oops, I'm just going to block things off for a minute or two. So those of you that are still with me and have noticed that we missed out number 5, go back to your original slide that gave you the 6 and which one is missing? Can you remember? Can you guess? And if you can't, here it is. Self-compassion. So for some bizarre reason, self-compassion slide has disappeared from the slide deck. I did a webinar the other week on compassionate leadership, something that again has become popular, maybe not the right word, but something that has really come to the fore over the past couple of years, and particularly past couple of months. That a sort of ability and willingness to understand other people's kind of suffering, but also to want to do something about it. So it's that recognition, that feeling, that sensing of other people's pain, but that drive and desire to do something about it. And you know, compassionate leadership is about that willingness and drive to help others, to support others, for the well-being of others. And there are very good organizational benefits for doing so. You know, there's no great surprise that a happier workforce, a workforce that is well psychologically, physically, etc., is one that's going to be more productive. So this is not rocket science, and yet so many organizations haven't worked out how to apply it. So compassionate leadership is all about, you know, understanding human behavior and the people that we have, and their wants and their needs and their drives, etc. But to be compassionate to others, you need to have self-compassion, that ability to be kind to yourself. And we've talked around again this already. So number one, mindfulness is key in this one. This taking that step back to be able to kind of be in that moment, and to kind of have this kind of suspension of judgment is really important in self-compassion. But just being kind to yourself, and this is the balance bit again, isn't it? Is if you're not kind to yourself, is recognize that it's okay to be so. That you know, there's nothing wrong with feeling good about yourself. Is about doing good things. It's not about being better than other people. It's just recognizing the good within you. So whether that's a good result because of good productivity, that you know, job you've done well, whether it's about just you feeling happy and content, etc., that's okay. You know, often we beat ourselves up a little bit too much on this kind of stuff. So compassion for others starts with self-compassion, and that self-compassion really is about being a little bit kinder to ourselves and not beating ourselves up as much as often we do. Negative self-talk is that ability to change that self-talk to something more positive, or even just more objective. I think it is really important. So have a closer look at self-compassion, and what I will probably do is I will make the compassionate leadership webinar available on the YouTube channel in the very near future. So I'll look back on it and edit it, because there's some good stuff around self-compassion, as well as compassionate leadership and compassion for others. So that was the 6 skills. Then allow me just to finish, if I may, for a couple of minutes on something that is close to my heart, something I talk about quite a lot, because I think, you know, this is, as a way of kind of summing up emotional control, then we don't have to look too much further than the chimp paradox and Dr. Steve Peters, who I think describes, you know, beautifully in his book what kind of goes on inside the head in terms of how well we can control our emotions, or our chimp as he calls it. So the limbic system is what he calls the chimp, that emotional part of the brain that can get us into all kinds of trouble. Remember the statement I said right at the beginning: when was the last time you said or did something that immediately or soon after you wish you hadn't? And for many of us, it's all too often where we just kind of lose a bit of control, mentally, emotionally, physically, etc. So he balances out, you know, so we have the limbic system, our very powerful emotional chimp. We have the frontal system, so the sort of the higher cortex, the neocortex, the part of us that is us, but is that ability to apply logic and ration and reason. It's the bit that we need to kind of be able to regulate our emotion. We have it. We are perfectly capable of doing so. However, for many of us, it's just that part of the brain is not as powerful as our limbic system. Our emotional brain is very powerful. And unless managed, then can get us into trouble, mainly because we have this other third part of the brain that Peters identifies, which is the parietal part of the brain, which he calls the computer, i.e. all our kind of thoughts and feelings and experiences, etc., go into our computer, and that becomes our operating system. So it's the kind of stuff that we do without thinking about. It allows us to drive a car without kind of thinking too much about that, although that's debatable as to whether that's a good thing. But our kind of little habits, our ability to get up in the morning and kind of get dressed and do all the things that we do without having to think about it, which is great, because if we did have to think about every single thing we do, you know, our brains would probably fry. The problem is the quality of stuff that we're putting in the computer. And if the chimp runs riot, then we can put some quite significant emotional gremlins and goblins, as he calls them, into the system that once in the system are very difficult to remove and will probably keep repeating in our habits, and will just lead to thoughts, behaviors that really are on one hand unproductive, on the other hand pretty destructive. So it's your ability to manage your chimp. You can't kill your chimp, you can't get rid of your chimp, so you might as well get used to your chimp. I think Peters even talks about naming your chimp. You know, give your chimp a name, you know, recognize it, but then manage it. He talks about sort of 4 different techniques. I've kind of summed this up into to 3. So here are kind of my take on Steve Peters' kind of tips and tools, techniques for managing your chimp. He does talk about exercising it, but maybe not quite in the same way that I do. I think there are 2 elements to exercising your chimp. On the one hand, we need to talk about physical well-being. So your emotions are better regulated or more easily regulated when you are well, what's the word I'm looking for? Where your physical well-being is well maintained, and what I'm talking about here is your diet is good, that you are well hydrated, whether you had good sleep, whether you've been able to take time to think and perhaps to meditate, and taken physical exercise. It's no surprise that emotionally we are more stable if physically we are in good shape. So when I talk about exercise, what I'm talking about here is physical well-being, good diet, good hydration, good sleep patterns, good mindfulness, taking time out and thinking. All of those things become really important. Steve Peters talks about exercise in a slightly different way. So physical side is really important. What he talks about is just kind of letting your chimp out. So your emotional self needs to come out. And as I say, you know, physical exercise, a good way of doing this is we can get through a lot of it kind of exuberance or frustration or excitement or anger and frustration through physical exercise. But what he's saying is it needs to get out somewhere down the line. And so if we can do it physically, then great. But the other way of doing it is what I will call venting. Sometimes it's called purging. And what I mean by that is you know, we need to better kind of let it out. And I've already said about these kind of conversations we always kind of used to have and hopefully still do have at work. The whinging and moaning that goes on over a cup of coffee or over lunch. That's venting. It's allowing your emotions to kind of go out in a controlled environment. So there's lots of different ways that we can kind of vent, and each one, you know, got a little bit careful of. So on the one hand, venting to others is great, is that ability to kind of whinge and moan at someone else before we're venting with a highly charged emotion. So being able to vent by having a whinge and moan to someone else who understands what you are doing, and it accepts it and understands the kind of process and does it back is great. Is having someone that you can vent to. Not having someone to vent to is not great. But also bringing venting into the domestic environment is not great. So, you know, we talk about relationships here, and going home and whinging about work every single day to your partner is probably not a great thing to do over a long period of time, particularly when that's not really understood as to what's going on. So we've got to be very careful about who we're venting to and their understanding of what's happening. we can vent to ourselves. So self-talk, I think, is really important. So actually talking to ourselves out loud is a great way of venting and exercising emotional control, exercising your chimp. So just going out and having a good talk to yourself is great. And just letting those frustrations out and talking whatever you want to go and talk for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes, however long it takes. It doesn't take very long before your chimp gets a little bit kind of, okay, done my bit now. It doesn't take long for the chimp to let it all out and all of a sudden go, right, I'm done. I've had my say. Now, frontal lobe, now adult, you take over and come up with something kind of sensible. I've done my bit. So self-talk out loud is good. Failing self-talk out loud, if you're not in the environment, then just talking to yourself inside your head, that works too. So there's no problem with kind of giving yourself a good talking to within your head. It's just slightly more effective if you're doing it out loud. Other ways of venting in a much more controlled environment might be just things like kind of writing a journal, some kind of diary. It might be doing some kind of, you know, video vlog or something like that, although be careful where you're posting your events. If you're doing that on social media, that can not be recommended at certain times. But getting your kind of thoughts down and out, and particularly sort of writing them down in some kind of journal, as I say, is quite a nice way of venting in some way, shape or form. Whichever way it is it's the old way of letting those emotions come out before it's too late, is to have that on a sort of fairly consistent and controlled basis, so that what we don't have is this pent up sort of frustration and anger and emotion that then goes out at the wrong time. So if we have a well-exercised physical chimp and a well-exercised chimp in terms of it being allowed out and allowed to vent its frustrations, then most of the time that should be enough. That should keep us in control. If we're doing that on a day-to-day basis, our chimp will begin to understand when it can and when it can't let loose. The third option then is kind of what we call the boxing option. And often the boxing one is when all of a sudden we're starting to kind of lose emotional control a little bit. So maybe we haven't trained our chimp well enough, or maybe there's something kind of more extreme that we're not able to control as well. It's something new or something, you know, literally kind of quite dangerous or challenging that we're having to face. So there are times when we're going to need to box the chimp. Our ability to box the chimp, i.e. to tell our chimp to just get back in its box for a period of time, let the human, the frontal lobe, deal with it, and then we'll let the chimp out later, is something that is a real skill. And that's what we're trying to move towards, is that learning to be able to box that chimp. So this happens over a period of time. There are techniques, of course, that we can use that will help us in the really short term. And most of us know what they are. So they're things like counting to 10. They are things like deep breathing. They are things like distraction, is literally going to look at something else or go and do something else, is just kind of move away physically or mentally from where that challenge, that perceived threat is, whatever it is that's getting that chimp out of the box. And that just might buy you enough time for your human, your frontal lobe, to kick in and go, okay, right, while the chimp is distracted counting to 10 or trying to breathe, we can now put something in place. So these are effective techniques, but they are short-term techniques. And I think what's really important is once you apply those techniques, if you have fooled your chimp a little bit by distracting it, is that you need to recognize and reward. So I think Steve Peters talks about giving your chimp bananas, i.e. is that if you have distracted it, if you have asked it to go back in its box, or you have kind of got it counting to 10 while you've kind of been able to cognitively diffuse, you need to reward that good behavior. So you need to be able to go, right, and now we will go out and we will go for a run or a jog, or we'll go and scream, or we'll go and have a chat to someone, we'll go and have a beer. Allow that chimp to exercise or to vent, but you're doing so in a controlled and safe environment, one of your choice, rather than at a time when it hasn't been of your choice and your chimp has got out of his box and caused mayhem. So 3 techniques. Go read the book, The Chimp Paradox. It's a really simple read, but quite an in-depth read. For those of you that are struggling sometimes with doing things, saying things, thinking things that you kind of wish you hadn't, then go and have a look at The Chimp Paradox. Otherwise, we talked to a fair few things. You've got your 6 skills. I did put those on Facebook, and I'll continue to kind of do so and to add to some of those techniques and tips around the 6 skills for emotional regulation. Also a bit more perhaps on emotional control, and as I say, I will in particular put that video link available in a couple of days' time for leadership, and I think, you know, emotional leadership that may be quite useful for some in terms of what's the word I'm looking for here. I can't now remember. My brain started to get gone. I can't remember where it's coming from now. So yes, I will put the video on. Oh, why can I not think? Anyway, enough. I'll leave the webinar as it is right now. Video on leadership, and I will also post this video. Thank you very much for your time today, folks, and I hope to see you. We have another webinar on the 11th of June, now moving into our C of commitment. So this one will be around goal setting. So some good positive psychology stuff around goal setting. We will talk smart objectives, but only very briefly. There's lots of other good stuff around in terms of setting goals. So I hope that you can join me on the 11th of June. I hope you enjoyed this recording. Feedback is always welcome. Have a look at the website, letstalktough.co.uk. Have a look at the Facebook page, and hopefully I'll catch up soon. Thank you, everybody.